In Chapter 6, we are going to look at the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress is bicameral. This means that it has two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We are going to look at the differences between these two chambers, as well as other important information about this institution, the legislative branch. There are really no limits to the questions we can ask about Congress, but perhaps two of the most important are: why do members of Congress follow complex, arcane rules and precedents in processing legislation, even when such devices keep majorities from getting their way? In fact, we could ask whether it is in fact true that they follow these methods, or whether these methods are used as a way of not doing things that members of Congress actually prefer not to do. When you look at something like the filibuster, which could be ended at any time by a majority vote of senators, you ask yourself, well, but why don't they? And certainly giving a member of Congress cover for not supporting legislation that he doesn't want to support, but that his constituents want him to support, may be one of these reasons. Another is that congressional incumbents rarely lose elections. So why are they so obsessed with the implications of nearly everything they do as it relates to elections? Well, that could also be a chicken and egg problem, right? Maybe members of Congress are much safer because of the actions they take. Well, think about these questions as we go through this slide presentation. So why do we study Congress? Well, first of all, Congress makes the laws. If we're interested in how laws get made, if we're interested in why and how the processes of lawmaking occur, then Congress is where we have to go. Also, Congress is transparent when compared to the other branches of government. Particularly the presidency, unless somebody leaks information, we never understand why they do what they do. In the Supreme Court, they actually justify their decisions, but they make their decisions in secret meetings that we don't even get to find out about until after the members have retired. There's a connection between power and party control. Obviously, there's a connection between power and party control in the presidency, but there's only one president. And they're officially not members of any party in the Supreme Court. But it is interesting to see how the party organizations in Congress tend to emphasize the power of the majority over the minority. There's also a connection between rules and power. Parties set rules, and that's how they get to determine the outcomes in most cases. And also there's a lot of inertia, and we get to study this. If we believe that very little change occurs on a day-to-day basis, studying Congress will help us understand why. Article 1 sets out the powers of Congress and does things such as set qualifications for membership. Things like the age of members of the U.S. House of Representatives needing to be 25, while in the U.S. Senate it's 30. Now, the difference between 25 and 30 is not really that significant. Even at the time of the founding, a great majority of the members of Congress were older than 25 and 30. It wasn't like there were all these people who would otherwise have had the job and were cut off from it. But it does show relatively the idea that members of the U.S. Senate are supposed to be more established political figures. In fact, Senate comes from a term meaning old people, old men representing the city in ancient Greece. The powers of Congress are enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. In addition to this, part of Article 1, Section 8 is a necessary and proper clause, which spells out the power to enact laws that are necessary and proper to effectuate the other enumerated powers. The U.S. Senate is probably the most powerful upper house in any bicameral legislature in a democracy in the world. And the U.S. Senate has powers over confirming judges, officers of the United States, which we all learned recently means people who are appointed to serve in the executive branch, and also to ratify treaties. Lawmaking, though, is a joint power. The president and both houses of Congress must concur in order for a bill to become a law. So if we're to talk about elections for Congress, we should keep in mind that we have both primary elections and we have general elections. The nominations in almost every state are secured through a primary system. We just had a primary. And what happens is that the winner of the primary then goes on to the general election. And the general election is between the two parties plus any third parties or independent candidates running. But in essence, we have a two-party system, as would be predicted by Duverger's law. Duverger was a social scientist who said that whenever you have a system like ours, the plurality, first past the post, as they say, system, where only one person wins per district, there's a strong tendency to have only two candidates from a district, the incumbent and somebody running against him. If you have more than that, you tend to split the opposition vote and make it even more difficult to unseat an unpopular incumbent. But even more so, imagine you're picking a third candidate. If that third candidate is not, so by third candidate, we mean somebody who's in third place. Let's say you vote for a third place candidate. What you are actually doing is you're taking a vote away from whoever you would have voted for if there were two candidates, and you're giving it to that third candidate. And well, now maybe that vote would have been nobody, but most often you do see that people vote for one of two candidates, and the turnout is not appreciably higher when there is a third candidate. So the second, or one of the two top candidates is losing a vote when a third person votes. So you're actually harming your second choice by voting for a third choice that doesn't have a reasonable chance of winning. Now, there's ways to overcome this, such as proportional representation that we've mentioned. However, in the United States, for Congress, all elections are either by plurality or majority vote. In Georgia, we actually have a majority vote system that says after the general election, we'll have a runoff if nobody receives 50% of the vote. The U.S. House of Representatives has 435 members. They are allotted on the basis of population, with large states like California receiving more representatives than small states. In fact, California has 52 members of Congress, while a state like Wyoming only has one. There's 14 members of the House of Representatives from Georgia. After each census, U.S. law sets the size and apportionment. There's a rule for how it's set up, designed to make sure that the difference between the largest and smallest districts is as small as possible. States within limits, though, are able to determine the actual shape of the district. That's called redistricting. Over here you see a rather oddly shaped district that was drawn to make sure that communities of common interest were drawn together. The process of drawing districts for the purpose of receiving a particular outcome is called gerrymandering. The constitutionality of gerrymandering has been challenged in court, but without success. For the most part, states are not allowed to draw districts in order to benefit or harm a member of a race or ethnicity. However, they are allowed to draw districts in order to benefit political parties. Unlike the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate is designed to give unequal representation, or rather, it is designed to give each state equal representation, even as this does not ensure one person, one vote in the Senate. The U.S. House was designed to provide as close as possible that every district would be the same across the country. Now, it's 770,000 people on average for each U.S. House of Representatives member. But in the Senate, you'll see representation vary greatly. For instance, California has the same number of representatives too as Wyoming, even though California has many times more people than Wyoming does. For all of the importance of political parties, we actually see that many elections are very candidate-centered. Now, this was especially true maybe 40 years ago, with an increasing importance of people voting based on the political party that they would like to see controlling the House of Representatives or the Senate. What we really see is that prior to 1994, when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years, there had been an increasing expectation that the Democrats would control the U.S. House, and therefore fighting over who was in control wasn't quite as important as making sure that an individual who represented your district was representative of your district. Remarkably, over 85% of U.S. House incumbents win re-election, often with very comfortable margins. So we might wonder, why do electoral worries do so much to shape congressional life? And the answer is most likely that the incumbency advantage does not automatically accrue. It stems from a diligent use of the many resources that come with holding office, especially as it relates to fundraising and even the ability to interact directly with your constituents. Some have asked why we even have political parties in Congress. In fact, we had political parties in Congress before we had mass political parties. Well, some of this is because of collective action problems. Without parties, you tend to have members of Congress shirk their duties to make sure that institutionally important things such as budgets are passed. When the party is able to work together and to enforce discipline on its members, you overcome that collective action problem. In addition, it lowers transaction costs. By having two parties, you have two parties' positions on the issues that get reflected rather than numerous different views. You could potentially have 435 different policy alternatives if each member of Congress in-house created his own laws to cover each and every policy. There's natural divisions related to partisanship and ideology. But this idea of the division of labor is one of the most important. If you are a member of Congress and you have to know something about every issue, it's so much more useful to divide up into committees and to trust certain people and certain the leaders or your representatives on each committee to carry out what you would have them do. Now, one of the main ways that Congress is structured is through its leadership. Both political parties have leaders in the House of Representatives. The majority party is actually controlled by the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House has an institutional role, being the person who officially presides over the House of Representatives and directs much of its business. However, that person is also the leader of the political party to which she belongs. Also, other important leadership roles are the majority leader, who represents the interests of the majority party on the floor. The speaker doesn't traditionally speak to the on bills. However, the majority leader is the person who advocates and organizes debate on the floor, and the majority whip, who is the chief vote counter for the majority party. The minority leader and the minority whip have similar roles to the majority leader and the majority whip. The assistant minority leader is an office that is more influential in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has decided that when they're outside of the, when they don't have the majority in the House, that they'll still have 3 leaders to parallel the Republican leaders when the Republicans have a Speaker of the House. The Republicans don't do this. The more equivalent job amongst Republicans is the Republican conference chair, the person who guides the official party meeting of the Republican Party. Well, anyway, you don't have to know who the Republican assistant minority leader is, but the other 5 positions, you should know who the people are who hold those offices. As I record this, Mike Johnson is the Speaker of the House. He held sort of a tenuous position because the Republicans have only a very tiny majority in the House. And so any 1 or 2 Republicans who are complaining about his leadership could potentially have him removed. He is seen as a Trump ally, and Trump was instrumental in helping him keep his job after the 2024 election. As compared to the House of Representatives, the leadership in the Senate is much less powerful. In fact, the leadership in the Senate is divided between formal leaders and the actual most powerful people. The formal leadership of the U.S. Senate is comprised of the President of the Senate, who is actually the Vice President of the United States, and the President pro tempore, or often called the President pro tem, who is the longest serving member in the majority party. However, the real power is in the majority leader. The majority leader leads the party in power from the floor and organizes debate and organizes the priorities of the party. There's an assistant leader who's often called the majority whip, who's in charge of vote counting. And the minority has a parallel leadership structure of a minority leader and an assistant minority leader. You should know these people and who holds these positions. The majority leader is the most powerful member of the U.S. Senate. The official leader of the Senate, the vice president, is often not even at the U.S. Senate. And the president pro tem is usually one of the most powerful of the committee chairs. But as a practical matter, what happens is that the majority leader represents the party, is elected by the party to present their interests on the floor. Now, the Senate has become much more centralized in recent years, with the filibuster having less and less of a role, especially when it comes to the confirmation of presidential appointees and judges. However, most of the work of the Senate still occurs by something called unanimous consent. What happens is that the majority leader usually will ask unanimous consent for an agenda item to be the next thing up. And when they do that, if nobody objects, then on the next day, that's the first item for business, and they proceed to it. However, if somebody were to object, they would have to actually go through a process called cloture, which for most votes would take 60 members of the Senate to vote for cloture, which is to cut off debate. Even after they cut off debate, they have another period of time for continued debate. Most of the time that's 2 hours now in the Senate. However, if you don't get the necessary votes to cut off debate, then debate can continue indefinitely. For nominations and appropriations, though, you only need 50 votes, or, well, a majority to cut off debate. We've talked an awful lot about the structure of Congress without talking about one of the most important aspects, and this is that of committees. Much of the work of Congress actually occurs in committee, not on the floor. Standing committees actually have responsibility over policy areas and lawmaking. The party ratio, which is to say the number of members of the majority party to the minority party, determines the partisan makeup of these committees. The best committees to be on, of course, deal with money, and the worst deal with administration. Do you really want to be the guy who decides how much money we're going to give to the Library of Congress, or do you want to be the person who decides how much money we're going to give to the Department of Defense or Homeland Security or social welfare programs? The large committees are actually divided into subcommittees that are even more specialized. In addition to the standing committees, there are other committees called special committees. They used to be called ad hoc committees. These special and select committees are actually responsible for particular areas of research, but not actual policy making. They're not as prestigious as the standing committees. However, some of them, such as the Intelligence Committee, are very important in their own right. You also have what are called conference committees, which are a special kind of joint committee that determine and negotiate the differences between laws that are passed in the House and laws that are passed in the Senate, because in order for a bill to actually become a law, it needs to be identical between the House and the Senate, and the conference committees negotiate this. Now, again, some things like, protecting the building and dealing with renovations of the Capitol, the Library of Congress, etc., have joint committees that are more permanent joint committees that actually have members of the House and members of the Senate who work together in order to fix and deal with problems that that are of concern to both the House and the Senate. Now, the best committees, the so-called money committees, are the Appropriations Committee for the House and the Senate, the Ways and Means Committee, which is the House committee that is in charge of taxes. The Senate committee in charge of taxes is called the Finance Committee, and then the Budget Committee. Now, the difference between the Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee is that the Budget Committee works out an overall budget designed to make sure that the cost of government overall is taken into account in determining how much money can be spent on specific needs. However, the Appropriations Committee is the one that actually determines how the money is spent. And the Budget Committee is nowhere near as important as the Appropriations Committee, because given enough support on the floor, the Appropriations Committee can even supersede the Budget Committee's general parameters. Now, the authorization committees are all the other committees, all the other standing committees, and they're the ones who do things like determine what the Department of Defense should be allowed to do during the next 2 years, what the Department of Commerce should do, how they should handle the census, and so on. Now we finish with a two-slide overview here on how a bill becomes a law. And I'd like you to actually look at the textbook here and to follow along. What you see is a parallel procedure that occurs in both the House and the Senate. Now in the end, the House and the Senate need to come to a compromise so that the two bills are exactly the same. When the two bills are exactly the same, they're what's called enrolled, which means that the actual official document is printed up and is made ready to send to the president. Before that, the House and the Senate operate independently in marking up and considering each of the bills and amending them and moving them through this process. So anyway, I would like you to look at the book for any additional detail on this section.